is, well, why was she seeking Jesus? Why was she going after him? And we find comments made in Matthew's account, for instance, in chapter 9, where it records this miracle. And it says that she was thinking to herself, and this is why she sought out Jesus, that if I only touch his garment, I will get well. I'll get well. And that's what drove her to try to get up close enough to Jesus to touch his garment, because she was, in other words, a woman in great despair at this point in her life. She certainly recognized the fact that she had a serious problem in her life. In Luke chapter 8 and verse 43, it said she had a hemorrhage for 12 years. For 12 years. You know, when we think about chronic illnesses, they are devastating to us. You know, when somebody has an illness that lasts that long, it's debilitating. And it's not just the physical part of it that wears us down, but it's also the idea of, am I ever going to get well? Am I ever going to get over this? And you know, you start going and you try to go to one doctor and you go to another and you keep plugging away at it, and they might come and they might offer a suggestion or two that might help. They knew somebody that had something similar. Maybe this would help you too. And you know, she listened to a lot of that. She tried a lot of that. And in fact, it says that she went and she tried to be treated, but nothing worked. In fact, she just got worse as time went on. This was a problem of a serious nature. And when you think about a blood issue, you know, there are a lot of blood issues that we struggle with even today. Whether it be something like leukemia, and trying to deal with leukemia, or maybe it's sepsis in our bloodstream. Maybe it's even, for some, sickle cell anemia. I remember seeing a young black girl in the hospital one time, visiting up there, and she had sickle cell anemia. I didn't know a whole lot about it, but it was very painful. It's a very painful thing, and it was hurting her, and she was in pain with it, but there wasn't anything that they could really do, or what they could do was very limited, I guess I should say it that way. But you know, when you think about that, and you think about the fact that you try hard and you work hard to find a cure and to get a cure, because you know that the problem you have is serious. And if you've had one for 12 years, you know it is a serious thing. We may, in fact, recognize that physical problems like that grab our attention, and we sometimes are captivated by it, but do we also recognize that there are spiritual sicknesses that can be just as complex and just as hard on our soul as those things are on our physical person? And we might recognize the fact, you know, that we have a problem, and we have to come to that conclusion before we can really find any kind of means of addressing it. You know, in verse 43, it said there that she could not be healed by anyone. And the fact is that she realized that the friends she had, the doctors that she had, just could not rectify this particular issue. There was a hospital in Oak Ridge where I grew up. It was called ORAU. That was the acronym for it. It was Oak Ridge Associated Universities. And it wasn't a big hospital. It was a specialty hospital, though. And the patients they took in there many times didn't make it out. We'll just say it that way. They were trying things to try to help those who were in last stages of different kinds of cancers and leukemias and things along that line. And we would pass by that hospital every time we'd go to church. And it was on the way to church that we would see it there. And it was a constant reminder that there are limits. There's limits to what doctors can do. Not because they're ignorant or not because they haven't tried their best, but just because it's beyond their capability. And there are limits as to what we can do to help one another. And sometimes, I think, like with this particular woman, we have to recognize that I can't fix this. I can't fix my problem, and neither can anybody else, no matter how sincerely they try, and no matter how much effort they put forth. It's just not going to happen. There are some situations like that are simply beyond our capability. Maybe we think back into the Old Testament and we remember Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how that they were sentenced to be thrown into the fiery furnace. Well, there wasn't anything they could do about it. They couldn't stop it from happening without capitulating and bowing down to the idol and so forth. That was their only way out. And they weren't going to do that, but there weren't enough friends to rise up and save them from being thrown into the fiery furnace. There wasn't any way that somebody was going to rescue them. The only way they would escape that was by the power of God. And lo and behold, God did intervene in their behalf. And they came out of that situation without even a hair on their body being singed, even though it took the lives of the guards who took them up there to throw them in. We recognize the fact that sometimes there are limitations to what we or others can do. And we have to recognize that it's not them that we need to depend ultimately on. It's God Himself. And so we look at verse 44, and it says that she basically took her problem to Jesus. And that's precisely what happens here. She comes up behind Him and touched the fringe of His cloak, and immediately it says that her hemorrhage stopped. She sensed that it stopped, and she understood that it had stopped. She could tell she was well. She knew the difference between being well and feeling like she had for 12 years. And she knew the difference there. And she went to Jesus because she knew that that would make a difference. While nobody else could help, she turns to Him to find the help that she needed. Kind of reminds us, doesn't it, of the hymn that's in our book that says, "Where could I go but to the Lord?" And it makes some good points in the verses that we read there. Living below in this old sinful world, hardly a comfort can afford. Striving alone to face temptation sore, where could I go but to the Lord? Neighbors are kind, I love them every one. We get along in sweet accord, but when my soul needs manna from above, where could I go but to the Lord? Life here is grand, with friends I love so dear. Comfort I get from God's own word. Yet, when I face the chilling hand of death, where could I go but to the Lord? There has to be that sense of recognizing that it is to the Lord that we need to take our problem. When Bartimaeus, who was blind and on the side of the road, heard that Jesus was coming by, he called out and he said, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." He took it to someone who could make a difference in his life, and Jesus healed him of that. Some friends took a paralyzed man and lowered him down through the roof in the front of Jesus Himself inside the house. And Jesus healed the man. They took him to someone that they couldn't help him. The only thing they could do was get him to the Lord Himself. And as a result of that, he too found the healing that he needed in his person. And we might observe from this, as we look at what happens with her, as she creeps up behind Jesus and reaches out and touches the hem of his garment, that we find out that Jesus is not angry that He helped someone, but rather he was willing to help her. He just wanted her to be seen by other people as having been helped. And I think we would look at Jesus as being someone who is, in fact, willing and to be the one to help us. And he is always available to us. And that's why I think it's important that when we think about seeking and finding, that we can, in fact, seek the Lord and we will, in fact, find Him. It took 72, 73, 74 years to find some of those ships we mentioned. And it took a long time, but we don't have to wait that long to find the Lord if we are really seeking after Him. He invites us, in fact. He says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Not many doctors make house calls these days. They're simply not able to do that. But isn't it interesting to hear John say of Jesus in Revelation 3 and verse 20, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." Wouldn't it be a wonderful thing to think that, your doctor came to your house to check on you and to see you? But Jesus Himself is pictured as knocking on the door, you might say, especially the door of our life that He wants us to open up to Him. And in fact, Paul reminds us that He's not far from every single one of us in Acts chapter 17 and verse 27. Jesus is not only a willing helper that's available, but He's a willing helper that has the power to do something. He has the power to help. Do you notice there in verse 44 that it says when she touched Him, that immediately she was healed? That it didn't take 6 months. It didn't take a year. It didn't take 4 or 5 days. It was immediate. And her recovery was immediate. And she is the purpose, or the person here rather, that demonstrates that nothing is impossible with God. Sometimes we give up, but we ought not to give up on the Lord Himself. There have been untold millions of lives that have been transformed from total wrecks to being someone who has the knowledge of who God is and their life put on a straight and narrow path. They have come out of things like, drunkenness. They've come out of things like drugs. They've come out of things like immorality. They've come out of things that where they have been consumed by greed and money. And they've been able to throw that off, not by their own power, but because of their faith in Jesus Christ. The beautiful passage found in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 points all of that out. And Paul says of them that were guilty of those kinds of things, "Such were some of you." You're not that way now, but you used to be. What's the difference? You came into contact with the Son of God, and He transformed your life. And there is, in other words, a balm in Gilead that will soothe the sin-sick soul. Jesus truly knows how to help, and He knows who is out there to help, and He knows, I'll submit, who is seeking His help. And that's kind of what we see, I think, when Jesus questions about what's going on here. In verse 45 to 48, He just says, "Who is the one who touched me?" And while they were all denying it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "No, someone did touch me, for I was aware that power had gone out of me." Now, I wonder as we can see and feel the situation out there as it unfolds, and we know that there were masses of people surrounding Jesus wherever He went, and we know that they must have been pushing in, and I guess the apostles were kind of acting like a buffer for the most part, to kind of keep people from grabbing and all that sort of thing as He would walk down the streets and go from place to place. But you know that there were a lot of people who broke through that. She did, for instance. She was able to get close enough to touch His clothes, and she did. But the fact is that it wasn't just somebody trying to glad hand him, and say, hey, I touched this guy who's the specter of the world these days that people are all gawking about and everything. I got in there, and she touched him. She touched him because she knew something about who he was, that he was the one who could make the difference in her life. This woman was seeking the Son of God. And the fact is that he tells her, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your faith has made you well. She out of faith reached out and touched him, not just caught up in the popular movement of things, wanting to push up on the stage and touch the guys in the band and all that kind of stuff. No, this was something more than that. This was something that was generated by faith in her life. Jesus knows who it is that touches him in that regard. And that's why I think also in the Sermon on the Mount we hear the Lord say, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. There's a difference in trying to reach the Lord and out of just maybe a wonderment and so forth, and reaching out to him in faith, believing who he is and what he is able to do. And in fact, as we look at how that closes out there in verse 47 and 48, it says, when the woman saw that she had not escaped notice, she came trembling and fell down before him and declared in the presence of all the people the reason why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. What a tremendous thing to hear. A woman who's been suffering for 12 years and who's now well, and she's being called out. She almost seems like she's afraid that she's in trouble here. She's trembling and all. But that's not the way Jesus treats her. He says, go in peace. Go in peace. Your faith has made you well. In the book of Psalms, David wrote in the 55th Psalm, and he says this, as for me, I shall call upon God, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning and at noon, I will complain and murmur, and he will hear my voice. He will redeem my soul in peace from the battle which is against me, for they are many who strive with me. Can we grab a hold of what David is saying there and maybe feel that too, that it's a battle that we're in sometimes, and we need to be able to morning, noon, and evening approach the one who knows what it's like and know that they can in fact redeem our soul in peace. It was the Lord who said in John chapter 14, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Do not let your heart be troubled or fearful. That reassurance that the Lord himself is capable and available to us to make a difference in our life is what allows us to go in peace. He tells us in John 16 and verse 33, these things I have spoken to you that you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage. I have overcome the world. Go in peace, he says. It is her faith that brought that about. Without her faith, she would have never reached out to touch the hem of his garment. Without her faith, she wouldn't even have been close enough, driven close enough, worked hard enough to get up there close enough to reach out and touch him. But it was her faith that moved her and got her there. And Jesus says to her, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. And peace in life comes to those who have faith. That's just the simplest way to put it. Do not let your heart be troubled. Believe in God. You believe also in me, in John chapter 14 and verse 1. He told the woman who washed his feet and anointed his feet with that expensive perfume, he says to her, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. He tells the Samaritan leper, 1 out of 10 who returned to thank him for being healed from leprosy, that you recognize that your faith has made you well. Go in peace. That's what he was telling him to do. And we looked at Bartimaeus for a minute ago, and how that he cried out for Jesus' mercy to help him. And Jesus says to him, your faith has made you well. It is the fact that we have faith in the Lord to be the one who is the great physician, not only for the troubles that we might feel in a physical way that we would pray to Him about, but also, more importantly, in a spiritual life that we walk, because without faith, it's impossible to please Him. For he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. This woman was in despair, and she had run all the limitations out that she could on who could help and who couldn't. And nothing was working in her behalf until she came to the Son of God. And He had time for her, didn't He? He took time for her. Even after she was healed by Him, He took time for her to address her and to let her tell her story to everybody who was within earshot of her on that particular day. And I would submit to us that He too has the power to help us, whatever malady we may be experiencing in life, whether it be a physical trauma that we're enduring, or whether it be a spiritual trauma that we're enduring. He is able to help us, and He has the wherewithal to do that, and He is willing to help us if we seek Him. Seek, and you will find. That is the key to what we see her doing here. And it's the key for us as well. Are we willing to seek the Savior? This evening it may be that we look at our life and we may feel like we've been carrying a burden for any number of years. And we might be ready to turn it over to the Lord Himself. We can kind of reach out and touch the hem of His garment even tonight if we want to. We can come to Him in faith, believing that He is the Christ, the Son of God. And we can confess our faith just like she did in saying, this is why I came to touch Him, was because I know who He is and what He can do for me. And we can, in fact, turn away from a life that was lived without Him. Maybe we tried to do the best we could on our own, but it didn't work. And we're ready to leave that and come and do things the Lord's way. And in repentance, we leave those things behind and we turn to Him. And when we are born again by being baptized into Christ, we become a new creature in Him. All things become new for us. And maybe I'm ready to take that step tonight. Or maybe I'm needing to revisit that again and say, I've wandered away and I need to come back. And this evening, if that's the case, let's come and confess those things and know that He is faithful and just to forgive us and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Would you come as we stand and while we sing?